By the time the first warning reached the garrison at Old Kraven, the men below were already dead. The soldier who delivered it came stumbling out of the lower stairwell with one hand pressed desperately against his stomach, as though determination alone might keep his insides where they belonged. Blood followed him across the stone in dark streaks, and whatever he had seen beneath the fort had stripped every trace of discipline from his face. The men in the yard understood the danger before he managed to speak. "They're inside." Then he collapsed. For the briefest moment, nobody moved. Something emerged from the stairwell behind him. At first, Sergeant Havoc thought some half-starved animal had found its way up from the lower tunnels, but that assumption lasted only until the creature crossed fully into torchlight. Animals do not carry knives, and this thing, whatever else it may once have been, held a blade fashioned from sharpened bone. It moved with an ugly speed that made the eye struggle to follow it properly. Its proportions were almost human, which made the sight worse rather than better. Gray skin stretched over narrow limbs, long hands, eyes that caught torchlight and returned it. The fallen soldier barely lifted his head before the creature reached him and drove the crude blade into his throat. Then more emerged. Not a hunting pack moving with animal instinct, but something more disturbing, fast, coordinated, relentless, climbing over one another in their haste to reach open ground. The yard exploded into motion. Men shouted warnings that came too late to matter. Steel left scabbards. Horses screamed from the stables hard enough to rattle timber. Havoc was already drawing his sword when he looked up and saw, in the quartermaster's office overlooking the chaos, a single lantern burning steadily in the window. It hung there with perfect stillness, untouched by panic below, as though whatever had begun beneath Old Kraven had not come unexpectedly at all. 17 years later, in the thoroughly unimpressive settlement of Lasker's Ford, Dorian was stealing from his sister with the calm confidence of a man who considered morality negotiable under certain culinary circumstances. This was not remarkable. Dorian possessed the particular kind of charm that allowed him to make poor behavior seem less like misconduct and more like a philosophical disagreement over ownership. He sat beside their mule on an overturned crate, studying a weathered route map with exaggerated seriousness while chewing dried meat that had, until recently, belonged to Elira. He was a large man in the honest sense of the word, broad through the shoulders and built by labor rather than vanity. Years of hauling salvage, fighting when necessary, and living where weakness invited trouble had given him the kind of physical strength that needed no advertisement. People who met him briefly often mistook him for stern competence. Those who knew him better understood he was simply incapable of taking life as seriously as circumstances often deserved. Elira inspired fewer misunderstandings. Where Dorian carried warmth openly, she kept hers under lock and practical supervision. Lean and athletic, with the balanced economy of movement that comes from climbing ruins, carrying heavy loads, and surviving bad roads, she looked dangerous even when standing still. Unfortunately for the judgment of local men, she was also strikingly beautiful in the sort of way that encouraged regrettable confidence in strangers. Lasker's Fort had taught most of them caution. Around them, the settlement was waking into its usual noise. Smoke drifted from cook-fires, fishermen argued along the river with suspicious emotional investment, and somewhere nearby a dog was making choices that would likely involve poultry, shouting, and eventual regret. It was not a pretty town. But it was alive. And on the Black Coast, that counted for something. The sort of people who imagine ruin scavenging to be adventurous have almost certainly never attempted it themselves. Adventure is a word generally favored by men who expect someone else to carry the heavier burdens. In practice, the profession involved long marches through hostile weather, disappointing discoveries, rusted metal that weighed more than its eventual worth, and the constant possibility of injury in places far enough from help to make optimism feel unserious. Yet it remained honest work in its own rough way. The Empire had abandoned enough roads, depots, checkpoints, and military outposts across the Black Coast that an enterprising scavenger could usually find something of value if willing to work hard enough and complain less than average. Broken iron could be reforged. Imperial tools fetched decent coin. Brass hardware, preserved nails, rope, hinges, fittings, someone somewhere always needed what civilization had once left behind. Their father had died in imperial service years earlier, which had earned the family formal condolences, several lingering debts, and precisely no meaningful compensation. Institutions, Elira had long observed, possessed excellent memories for obligations owed to them and remarkably poor ones for obligations owed by them. Winter, by contrast, never forgot anyone. So they scavenged. Dorian, naturally, preferred a more optimistic interpretation of their circumstances. He maintained the persistent belief that one sufficiently profitable expedition might alter the shape of their lives permanently. Enough money for land, perhaps. Enough to leave the Black Coast entirely and settle somewhere civilized, where roads remained roads and food did not require negotiation with marshland. Elira regarded these ambitions with the same indulgent skepticism one reserves for children explaining improbable engineering projects. Hope was not offensive in theory. It simply had a poor record of practical performance. Their first stop that morning was Crumbled Watch, which had once served as an imperial checkpoint and now resembled the sort of place even memory had abandoned. Time had not destroyed it dramatically. There had been no singular catastrophe, no heroic final stand worth preserving in song. Instead, the place had simply surrendered by degrees. Rain had found weakness in the roof. Ivy had claimed the stone wherever mortar failed. Wood had rotted patiently, and whatever authority once demanded tolls there had long since dissolved into forgotten paperwork and bone. Places like that often disappointed. Crumbled Watch did not break tradition. They found little worth carrying beyond a bent iron hook, a pair of rusted brackets, and fragments of hardware whose original purpose had become difficult to guess. Dorian persisted in examining each discovery with unreasonable optimism, as though sufficient enthusiasm might improve its market value. For a time, the work felt ordinary. That changed near the old gatehouse. Elira saw the tracks first. They pressed clearly into damp earth where rain had not yet softened the edges, recent enough to matter. Not bootprints. Not hooves. Bare feet, though narrower than she liked and oddly proportioned in ways she could not immediately define. Nearby lay a sharpened fragment of animal bone. Not discarded naturally. Worked. That was what troubled her. Ruins attracted scavengers, squatters, thieves, and occasionally desperate men with poor alternatives. None of that would have surprised her. But desperate men generally preferred boots. Beyond Crumbled Watch, the road north deteriorated into the sort of route that remained usable mostly because enough stubborn people continued pretending otherwise. The marsh thickened around them as the day wore on. Water gathered where earth should have been firmer, and reeds crowded close enough to brush against passing legs with an intimacy Elira found irritating. The Black Coast possessed a particular genius for creating landscapes that felt neither fully land nor properly water, but some disagreeable compromise between the two. Dorian, predictably, remained in excellent spirits. This lasted until they found the deer. Or what remained of it. The carcass lay partly in the reeds beside the road, stripped with an efficiency that eliminated any comforting explanation involving simple predators. Bones had been cracked open deliberately. Marrow removed. Meat carved away in rough, uneven cuts that nevertheless reflected intention rather than instinct. Dorian crouched beside it longer than Elira preferred. He did not speak immediately, which in itself suggested seriousness. Then he noticed the sharpened length of bone half hidden in mud nearby. Not naturally broken. Fashioned. That altered the silence between them. Animals killed. Starving men butchered. But there existed an uncomfortable category between those two possibilities, and Elira found herself disliking the direction of her own thoughts. Ahead, somewhere beyond the marsh and failing light, Old Kraven waited. For the first time that day, the promise of profit felt less persuasive than it had that morning. Old Kraven came into view late in the day, rising out of the marsh in the manner of things that had once been built to impose order and had failed only because time is more patient than empires. Even ruined, the fort retained enough of its original shape to suggest what it had once been. Portions of the outer wall still stood in stubborn defiance of weather and neglect, though one tower had developed a visible lean that promised eventual collapse. The main gate hung crooked, and much of the yard beyond had surrendered to weeds, standing water, and the slow advance of whatever nature chooses to do when bureaucracy stops interfering. Dorian saw opportunity immediately. That was one of his more reliable qualities. Elira saw something else. There are abandoned places that feel merely empty, as though people have left and taken their importance with them. Old Kraven did not feel empty. It felt paused, as though something had interrupted its purpose rather than ended it properly. She did not care for that sensation. Instinct has preserved more lives than logic likes admitting. Their first hour inside the fort was profitable enough to make caution seem temporarily unreasonable. Old Kraven had not been stripped as thoroughly as Elira expected. Whether distance, rumor, or simple fear had kept scavengers away mattered less than the practical result. There was salvage everywhere once one learned where to look. They found usable rope in a chamber spared the worst of the damp, brass hardware worth decent coin, iron fittings, preserved tools, and eventually a sealed crate of nails so remarkably intact that Dorian looked at it with the unmistakable expression of a man experiencing religious revelation. Work imposed its usual rhythm soon enough. There is a particular comfort in practical labor, especially in unpleasant places, because it reduces the world to solvable problems. Weight can be judged, value estimated, rust evaluated, profit imagined. For a time, Elira found herself relaxing despite her earlier discomfort. That ended when she turned toward a corridor wall and noticed a storage crate had shifted. Not dramatically. Had she entered the fort that morning as some casual observer, she might never have seen it. But years spent scavenging ruined places sharpen certain instincts, and one of them is an excellent memory for where heavy objects ought to remain. This crate no longer sat where she remembered leaving it. She was still deciding whether to mention it when something scraped faintly against stone somewhere deeper in the fort. They found the lantern in what had once been the quartermaster's office, and for the first time that day, Elira felt something colder than ordinary caution. The room had survived better than much of the fort. A heavy desk remained upright beneath dust and water stains. Shelving leaned beneath ruined ledgers whose contents no longer mattered to anyone living. Cobwebs occupied the corners with admirable confidence. And beside the window hung a lantern. Lit. The flame was not strong, but it burned with a steady persistence that immediately offended reason. Dorian approached first, naturally. He had always possessed a curiosity that occasionally bordered on recklessness, though he preferred kinder descriptions. The metal casing was warm. That fact disturbed Elira more than the light itself. Dust lay undisturbed across every nearby surface. No footprints marked the room. No sign suggested recent occupation. Yet the lantern remained alive. A practical explanation surely existed. She simply failed to think of one she liked. Then the scraping came again. Closer now. No longer distant enough to dismiss politely. Something else was inside Old Kraven. Once the possibility of another presence entered the mind, silence became impossible to trust. Every shifting sound within the fort acquired significance. The settling of old timber. The distant drip of water. A faint movement somewhere beyond immediate sight. Dorian had grown quieter, which troubled Elira more than she admitted. He was not a fool, despite a lifetime of optimism suggesting otherwise, and she could see caution replacing enthusiasm in the way he now watched the corridors. Without discussing it, they began gathering what could be carried quickly. The more valuable items went first. Weight suddenly mattered differently when one imagined needing to run with it. Elira had just secured the last of the tools when something struck the far wall with enough force to send a scatter of dust drifting from cracked stone overhead. Both froze. This was not a building settling. This was movement. Deliberate movement. The corridor ahead remained empty for several tense seconds, and that uncertainty somehow proved worse than immediate attack. Then something moved. Fast enough that sight struggled to organize it properly. The first creature came out of the darkness with the violent speed of something that had spent its life learning how to close distances before prey could react. Elira's sword met it instinctively, the impact jarring through her arm with an ugly force that immediately distinguished this from any civilized duel. The thing recoiled, but only briefly, and in that instant she saw enough to understand why instinct had revolted before conscious thought caught up. It was close enough to human in structure to feel profoundly wrong. Gray skin stretched tightly across lean muscle. The limbs were subtly too long. The hands retained recognizably human function while looking as though nature had revised them under unpleasant conditions. A second creature lunged toward Dorian from the side, forcing him into immediate combat of his own. There was no elegance in what followed. Desperate violence rarely provides such luxuries. One of the creatures drove low past Elira, and its crude blade ripped through the lower edge of her clothing as it passed, tearing fabric across her side and exposing a flash of smooth skin above the hip and part of one leg before she pivoted and drove steel downward with enough force to drop it instantly. Had she noticed under calmer circumstances, she might have cared. At that moment, survival occupied the entirety of her attention. The attack ended almost as suddenly as it began. The surviving creatures vanished back into darkness. The dead creature lay twisted where it had fallen, and up close the resemblance to humanity became more disturbing rather than less. Distance allows the imagination merciful simplifications. Proximity removes them. Its body was lean but not frail, shaped by deprivation without surrendering strength. Sparse dark hair clung unevenly to parts of its limbs, and its hands, though distorted in proportion, were unmistakably the hands of something capable of deliberate manipulation. Most troubling of all was the weapon. The blade had been fashioned from sharpened bone, wrapped carefully in leather for grip. Primitive craftsmanship, certainly, but craftsmanship nonetheless. Elira understood the implication immediately. Animals kill. But animals do not make knives. Dorian remained crouched beside the corpse longer than she liked, studying it not with horror, but with thoughtfulness. That expression unsettled her, because she knew her brother. And she knew exactly the sort of dangerous sympathy intelligence might invite in him. The deeper passages beneath Old Kraven explained some things while making others considerably worse. The original stairway descended into storage corridors and utility spaces, built with the cold practicality Imperial engineers favored, but time had altered their purpose. Sections had partially collapsed, forcing awkward detours through broken masonry and narrow passages where damp stone pressed uncomfortably close. The air carried the stale mineral smell of old underground places, layered with rot, stagnant water, and something organic that had no business lingering so strongly. Then they found the iron rings. Heavy restraints had been bolted directly into the walls at regular intervals, some half swallowed by rust, others still stubbornly intact despite the years. Links of broken chain remained scattered nearby, and although their precise purpose was impossible to prove, Elira disliked how easily the answer suggested itself. Drakenshaft lay not far from Old Kraven. Old mining territory. Imperial extraction sites. The sort of places where men had once been sent below ground for labor that mattered more to administrators than to the bodies performing it. Dorian studied the restraints for a long moment without speaking. That silence carried more weight than commentary would have. If these creatures were descendants of abandoned miners, prisoners, laborers, or some other forgotten human population twisted by generations underground, then the problem before them had become morally more complicated than Elira preferred. Complication rarely improves survival. The second attack removed any comforting illusion that the creatures behaved on pure instinct. They had chosen the ground carefully. The corridor narrowed where a collapsed support forced anyone passing through to slow and angle sideways, and the attack came precisely when both siblings occupied the least advantageous position. One creature came from the front just as another dropped from a ledge above that neither of them had properly noticed in the gloom. That was not panic. That was planning. Dorian barely avoided having his skull opened by a descending bone blade, and only Elira's intervention prevented the strike from landing cleanly. Her sword caught the attacker hard enough to send it crashing sideways into stone, but even then the others adjusted with unnerving speed. One drove toward her flank while another attempted to press Dorian backward into the narrowest section of corridor where movement would become difficult. She hated intelligent enemies. Mindless predators could be anticipated. Thinking opponents introduced possibilities. The fight was short, violent, and far less reassuring than victory should have been. When the creatures withdrew again, they did so with purpose rather than panic. That distinction mattered. Dorian understood it as clearly as she did. She could see that in his face. That should have been the point at which sensible people abandoned Old Kraven entirely. Elira certainly believed so. The creatures were intelligent enough to set ambushes, familiar enough with the terrain to choose advantageous ground, and numerous enough that certainty regarding their full numbers remained impossible. Every practical argument favored immediate departure. They had already collected enough salvage to justify the expedition, but not enough to make leaving feel satisfying. Iron fittings, preserved tools, brass hardware, and the creative nails represented real money in Lasker's Ford. Not wealth, certainly, but enough to ease several difficult months. Dorian never argued directly. That would have been easier to dismiss. Instead, he simply asked whether they truly believed the creatures would continue pressing an attack after suffering losses, and whether abandoning valuable salvage because of fear aligned with the judgment they usually prided themselves upon. He was persuasive precisely because he was not entirely wrong. That was the irritating thing about him. So they stayed longer than wisdom recommended. History would eventually form strong opinions about that decision. By the time they finally chose to leave, dusk had settled over the marsh with the sort of steady inevitability only unpleasant landscapes truly appreciate. They loaded the mule heavily, abandoning only what absolutely failed to justify the weight. Conversation had become sparse by then, not from hostility, but because both had shifted into the practical quiet that danger encourages. Listening mattered more than talking. The road away from Old Kraven should have felt safer with every step. Instead, the opposite occurred. Elira developed the persistent sensation that departure had not ended anything, merely changed its setting. The reeds shifted constantly in the evening wind, and more than once she thought she saw movement pacing them just beyond certainty. Never close enough to confirm. Never absent long enough to dismiss. Dorian noticed it too. She could tell by the way he had stopped resting his hand casually near his weapon and instead kept it there with intention. Once, she looked back. Old Kraven stood dark against the failing light, broken but unmistakably present, like something unwilling to surrender attention simply because visitors had chosen to leave. And somewhere within those ruins, absurdly, impossibly, that lantern still burned. She disliked that detail more than she could comfortably explain. They found the wounded creature beside an old stretch of roadstone that had half sunk into marsh earth long before either sibling had been born. It lay partially against the broken stone as though it had dragged itself there deliberately, and at first glance even Elira believed death had nearly finished the work for them. It was smaller than the others they had fought, lean to the point of gauntness, with one leg bent at an angle no healthy joint should permit. Blood had soaked the ground beneath its side, and each breath arrived in shallow, wet efforts that suggested the body was functioning now through stubbornness rather than viability. It saw them immediately, but instead of attacking, it remained where it was, watching. Stillness changed the emotional shape of the encounter in ways Elira immediately distrusted. Distance makes enemies simpler. Motion makes violence easier. A wounded creature lying helpless against stone invites entirely different instincts. Dorian moved closer before she said anything. That was entirely in character. The creature clutched something in one hand, a crude arrangement of cord, bone, and carved fragments worn smooth by repeated handling. Whether it was a charm, a personal token, or some primitive ritual object hardly mattered in the moment, though its existence reinforced what they already knew. This was not an animal. Dorian's expression had shifted into one she recognized instantly. She had seen it directed toward injured dogs, stranded travelers, drunken fools, and anyone else unfortunate enough to suffer visibly within his line of sight. Compassion always arrived in him faster than caution. That had always been one of the things she loved most about him. And, in that moment, the thing she feared most. Dorian moved toward the wounded creature with the cautious patience one might reserve for frightened animals, and Elira understood with perfect clarity what was about to happen long before she found words sharp enough to stop it. That had always been one of the most infuriating things about her brother. His compassion was not naive in the childish sense. He understood violence. He had fought these things inside Old Kraven and killed one with his own hands. He knew what bone knives could do. Yet knowledge and temperament are not always allies. The creature remained where it lay, trembling against the broken stone, its breathing shallow and ragged, its ruined leg bent beneath it at a grotesque angle that made genuine helplessness seem entirely plausible. Then it made a sound. Small. Weak. A sound pitiful enough to strike exactly the sort of nerve Dorian had never learned to protect. He crouched. The attack came so quickly that memory later refused to arrange it properly. One instant the creature appeared barely conscious. The next, its arm moved with explosive precision, and the sharpened bone blade entered Dorian's throat just below the jaw. He made a sound Elira would remember for the rest of her life. Not a scream. Something smaller. More confused than afraid. The kind of sound made by a man who has not yet understood what has happened to him. Her sword killed the creature immediately, but speed had already become irrelevant. Blood forced itself through Dorian's fingers in dark, urgent pulses as he staggered backward and collapsed. And the world came apart. At first, Elira fought reality with everything she had. She dropped beside Dorian so violently that her knees struck stone hard enough to bruise, but the pain never properly arrived. Her hands were already at his throat, pressing desperately against the wound, trying to contain damage that immediately announced itself as catastrophic. Blood forced itself hot between her fingers in relentless pulses, coating her hands, running down her wrists, soaking into the fabric at her sleeves until grip itself became difficult. Dorian was still trying to breathe. That was what broke her. Not the blood. Not the attack. Not even the knowledge that the wound was beyond her ability to repair. It was the unbearable sight of the body continuing to attempt something it could no longer accomplish. His eyes found hers, and in them she saw something infinitely crueler than fear. Trust. Complete, unquestioning trust. As though she remained the person who could solve this. As though she would somehow make this right because she always had, in all the smaller ugly moments life had thrown at them, found some way to impose order where none existed. She spoke to him, though later she would remember none of the words. Perhaps she begged him to remain awake. Perhaps she lied and promised survival she already knew was impossible. It did not matter. Nothing changed. His fingers brushed weakly against her arm. His breathing became wetter. Less effective. Behind her, something moved in the reeds, but the sound barely registered because her entire world had collapsed inward to the impossible fact in her hands. Panic came first in the ordinary human sense. Her breathing shortened. Thoughts collided with one another so quickly they ceased resembling coherent thought at all. Urgency became terror, and terror became something too large for the mind to process cleanly. Then the strange part began. The panic did not intensify until it became hysteria. It reached some invisible limit and simply broke. That became intolerable. Retreat meant survival. Survival meant continuation. And something inside her had become utterly incapable of permitting continuation. She pursued them immediately, moving through the reeds with a terrifying economy that did not resemble fury so much as predatory inevitability. One creature stumbled turning toward her and died before completing the movement. Its throat opened so cleanly that blood sprayed across the water in an arc she barely consciously registered. Another attempted the same flanking tactic their kind had used beneath Old Kraven, but now she seemed to perceive intent almost before movement began. She severed its weapon hand first, then killed it before pain had fully reached its expression. A third fled deeper into the marsh. She followed because the existence of anything responsible still drawing breath had become psychologically unbearable. This was the Red Wake, though she would not hear the name for years. It was not rage. Rage is chaotic, exhausting, emotional. This was something colder and far more frightening. A mind shattered by trauma, leaving behind only movement, precision, and the absolute certainty that mercy no longer had any place in the world. By the time the last creature died, Elira was breathing hard, covered in blood, and standing among bodies with no immediate understanding of how much time had passed. Only when nothing remained moving did the world begin, slowly and terribly, to return. She felt it happen. Sound changed first. The marsh seemed to retreat from her awareness, as though distance had entered her own skull. Wind in the reeds became faint. The world grew remote. Even Dorian's failing breaths sounded strangely far away, as though she were hearing them through water. Then fear disappeared. Not courage. Not acceptance. Absence. A complete and unnatural absence where fear had been moments earlier. Pain followed. Then hesitation. Then pity. It was not a transformation in any dramatic or mystical sense. No revelation arrived. No sudden power flooded her body. Something in her simply failed in exactly the wrong way, stripping away every emotional mechanism that normally prevents human beings from becoming efficient predators. When she lifted her head and saw movement in the reeds, she no longer interpreted it emotionally. There was no grief. No rage, at least not rage as sane people understand it. Only absolute, merciless clarity. Something had caused this. That something remained alive. Therefore the work was unfinished. The first creature emerged expecting weakness. Instead, it encountered terrifying purpose. Elira crossed the distance between them with a speed that would later seem impossible to remember accurately, not because she had become physically superhuman, but because hesitation had ceased to exist inside her. Her sword entered beneath the creature's jaw and passed upward through the skull in one brutally efficient motion that left the body dead before momentum properly understood what had happened. Another attacked from her flank. She turned into the strike rather than away from it, allowing the crude blade to scrape across torn fabric and skin she did not feel while driving her own weapon deep into the attacker's ribs hard enough to wrench it sideways into the marsh. Movement to the left. 2 more creatures. Retreating. By the time Elira reached Lasker's Ford, dawn had already claimed the sky. The mules still carried the salvage from Old Kraven. That detail struck her with a cruelty so precise it almost felt deliberate. Iron fittings, tools, nails. All the practical little victories Dorian would have turned into optimism before they had even reached home. The town was waking exactly as it had the morning before. Smoke rose from campfires. Fishermen shouted at the river. Dogs barked. Someone argued over something utterly meaningless. The world had continued with astonishing indifference. People noticed her immediately. A blood-stained woman returning alone with torn clothing, and no sign of the man who had left beside her does not pass unnoticed in a settlement that small. Questions followed. She heard none of them. Or perhaps heard them and no longer cared. Their overturned crate still stood where they had left it. For a long moment, she simply stared at it. Then she sat. The same place where Dorian had stolen her breakfast less than a day earlier. In one hand, she still held the small carved figure taken from the dead. Proof that the creatures were something more complicated than beasts. Dorian would have cared about that. She did not. Not anymore. And as Lasker's Ford woke around her, Elira sat alone in the growing light, while somewhere deep inside, something cold and merciless waited patiently to be needed again.